So this is our female talent podcast series, number 1 for the UK talent series with Shelley Grayson. So thank you for joining me, Shelley. Would you like to introduce yourself very briefly?
Yeah, hi. I'm Shelley Schachter-Cahm. I'm a Chief Compliance Officer who has worked for around 25 years in traditional finance and 50 years in crypto. And I say 50 years in crypto because every year in crypto is like 20 years out in the real world. So it just feels like the pace there of what I've been doing has covered at least 2 careers in traditional finance. So I am faculty for ACAMS, the Anti-Money Laundering Certification organization that is global. I train the Council of Europe as an expert on anti-money laundering, and I really love using AI in compliance. So yeah, and fun fact, I used to be a DJ on a pirate radio station.
Oh wow, I did not know that. That's another string to your bow.
There you go.
Thank you, Shelley. So I'm Michelle, Director of the Risk Regulation and Compliance Division within InterQuest. And I've been in the industry 17 years and counting now. Background very much in risk analytics and compliance. Love hosting these type of events. You can see me hosting our Risk Roundtable events as well, in person, both in London and Manchester. But Shelley, thank you for joining me today. Great opportunity to get to know you a bit more and really understand a little bit more about how you have got to where you are today. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit more of your story, I'm sure others as well as me would love to hear.
No, thank you. And thank you for the interest, because it has been a long and winding road. And whilst it should have felt like a trajectory that went constantly up, what I have experienced is a lot of sideways moves and a lot of opportunities to grow both scope and depth of skills, and sometimes that hasn't always followed a traditional path. So I've actually started out my career in sales, and I'm quite chatty. Every time I leave a lift and there was someone else in the lift, I will have had a conversation with them. I like people. I really love people who aren't just like me, because I find them more interesting. So I'm not a revert type sort of personality. And that worked very well for me in sales. And the sales that I was undertaking was really populated by the sort of male, pale and stale, I'll take you for a round of golf, we'll go out for dinner and then the bars sort of salespeople, because they were selling their personalities. But I was working in ultra high risk, complex risk and insurance when I started in sales. And you had to be technically competent. And I saw that there were sales teams who would hand over everything technical to the technical teams, and they were sort of the party department. And it was the technical teams who would actually take care of the customers. And I wanted to take care of my customers. I wanted to know when I was selling to them that I could look them in the eye and with integrity say, I really understand you and I understand what I'm selling to you, and I can put my hand on my heart and promise you I have done the best possible job and this is the best possible solution. And you can't do that unless you dig down to the mechanics of what is your customer actually expecting and what are they actually getting. And that means for insurance, you've got to read the policies. You have to understand the terms and conditions. You have to know how claims work. And it's the same all over financial services, is that there is a huge amount of complexity and technicality behind that handshake that says, I trust you and you're going to work with me and you're going to serve me. And I felt that my customers who happened to mostly be female at the start of my career. We just gravitated towards each other. And that's been a bit of a theme for me throughout my career, is that I have been empowered, and I very much enjoy empowering women where traditional approaches have been less effective. So, and also because traditional approaches can be affected by pretty much anyone, but technical approaches, you have to be technically competent, and those that cater for niche views, you have to be able to see what a niche view would look like. So I've turned everything that could have been a lemon into lemonade, and taken every learning experience and turned that into, well, if I was sat on the other side of the table, how would that have felt? And empathy has moved me through from sales to, I started to draft insurance policies, because I wrote to so many insurance companies having bought an insurance policy and pointed out, you know, you have a spelling mistake here, and this clause doesn't make sense with this clause. And when I discuss it, because I thought that would be like perfect fodder for a discussion over a glass of wine with the girls, and they were all looking at me going, you are some sort of weird, because no one reads their insurance policy. And so understanding also that something I did as business as usual for me, that other people saw as a superpower, that was something that I knew I could take forward with less friction and a higher ability to monetize it than trying to force myself into a discipline where it would have been hard work and not my natural disposition to be in anyway. So I noticed stuff like, yes, I do read every contract, and that really slows me down when I'm logging onto the internet and different websites who say, do you agree with our terms? And I'm like, let me review your terms instead of just looking at. So I have to be a little bit selective, but I still do read them. And taking that from what I was doing before and putting it into the new world that we are entering every day when we wake up, some significant stuff has changed. So I moved from generalist high risk and insurance into infocom, which is what web was called in the olden days before there was a web, because I'm that old I can remember the days before the web. And companies who were telecom companies had previously never engaged with regulated entities as a normal customer would, because telecom companies, and by extension all the cell companies and all the internet companies, because they work through phone lines, all of these were owned by governments. And for younger people amongst your audience, that's not going to make sense, but it's just the way it was. BT was owned by the British government, and Telefónica de España was owned by the Spanish government, and Telecom Italia. I could go on and on. And so these companies had never needed to be commercial, had never needed to protect themselves, had never needed the sorts of facilities that commercial organizations need. And there were no rules for dealing with them, because they hadn't existed in this form of being private companies. And what do private companies need? Investment. What do you need to get investment? You need financial services organizations behind you saying, yeah, you're good to go, and we're going to give you money so you can execute your investment plans. So I was working in what was pretty much a regulatory vacuum. And that's what I found myself sucked into, is areas where there is no rule book to follow, or the rule book is nascent. So I moved from sales into insurance compliance at exactly the same point as the insurance big bang happened. So that meant anyone going out to market looking for an expert would have nowhere to look. There were no experts. The regime didn't exist before. And this is a pattern that I followed throughout my career, and it happened by accident. There was no strategy here at all. It's just, if you are naturally curious, if you like being at the cutting edge where there's far less of a safety net and there's more thinking to do, less doing, more thinking, then it is the nascent industries and nascent regulation which becomes really compelling. So I've worked my way through some really good big names, and I would recommend to everyone, get a big name on your CV. It really matters. It demonstrates that you know how to operate in a rigid, disciplined, rigorous corporate environment.
Yeah.
And that you can behave like a grown-up. But on the flip side, if you don't have some sort of start-up-y side gig, here's what I've done on my own, anyone who's looking for commercial and entrepreneurial values is going to dismiss you if all you've done is work for HSBC or the National Audit Office, and you've been there for 17 years and now you're going to go work in a startup. There will be some dissonance in terms of culture between those types of organizations, and being able to demonstrate that you bridge that culture gap, either through your character and your personality, or what you've done on the inside in a startup to bring rigor, discipline, and acting like a grown-up, or what you've done within a big corporate to bring some entrepreneurialism, ownership, a sense of I matter and why you matter. That's really important to bring out in not just your CV, but in your conversation, where you take ideas from one space and can transplant them successfully into a different space. So I ran up a bunch of good positions with insurers ranging from Marsh & McLennan, Aon. I then went to work for Aviva, and there's this typical thing of you go from insurance broker, you think the grass is greener being an insurer. All the insurers are looking at the brokers thinking the grass is greener being a broker. So just a word of warning there from the wise is that the grass is not always greener. It's up to you how you plant and nurture and water it. So after that, I did move into banking. I was with HSBC, which was an awesome experience on many levels, on learning how a truly global organization functions. Their talent programs were exceptional. They worked really slowly on stuff, but if you caught the right handle in HSBC, there were quite swift escalation mechanisms. And I have a great story there, which it's public knowledge. There's nothing I'm not sharing here, and it happened so long ago, everyone who was involved is either probably dead or retired, is that HSBC used to run a program called the Young High Potential Performers Program, where people under 40 were chosen from the cohort of employees who were doing really well and either deserved a reward for already having done well, or was showing such exceptional potential. They were placed on a very special training scheme with very special mentorship, lots of lovely dinners. There was a trip to Brazil to go save the rainforest involved, and an alumni network, which was for the future leaders of HSBC. You'll note the title was the Young High Potential Performers Program. I was 41.
Oh, wow.
I was 41 at the time this happened. It's almost 2 decades ago. So there's a little hint to how ancient I am now. But I challenged it and said, A, it's discriminatory, and whilst I wouldn't sue you, probably lots of other people would. So do you really want to exclude your talent pool of just as motivated, just as capable, bringing balance and diversity to this cohort of people who've never changed a nappy, to exclude everyone who can add something different? If you're looking at careers in HSBC as being 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, why are you excluding 41-year-olds? And they changed. I went to Brazil, I finished the program, and so that's just an example of how disruption can happen no matter what your role is. If you see something and it doesn't work, with the values that the organisation says it has, and your values, and you're willing to put some effort in, and you're willing to put your neck on the line for it as well, this might not have ended with the happy ever after it did end with. But it's worth putting yourself out there. It's one way to get noticed, is say, well, I'm protecting the organisation. Of course I'm self-promoting because it's in my interest to do that, but I'm not going to hide behind shame and say I'm not self-promoting. I wanted to do this course. I wanted to be viewed as a high potential individual. So it was in everyone's interest that something changed before they got sued. And maybe because it was the right thing to do as well. I like to think that was the reason something changed, was that it wasn't just a defense mechanism. So after HSBC, I also said, oh my gosh, this is like so long ago and there's been so many. But I can very quickly run off that I spent 2 years with EY. I loved some stuff about it, but I didn't like the rigidity of the hierarchy. I didn't fit in well with that. And knowing what doesn't work for you is as important as knowing what does work for you. And the challenge, and you'll know the challenge is like going to a job interview is like going on a first date and then getting married and taking on their 8 other children, right? Because you have an hour, everyone's on their best behavior. They want to sell you the company, you want to sell them you. And actually the stuff you'd really want to know coming out of a partnership, that you're going to spend more of your waking hours with them than you are with family members you either chose or created. It's a pretty appalling way to choose how to spend your life as a 1-hour interview. So I like to think that I'm never going to make those sorts of mistakes again. I will do enough research for my questions to be meaningful at interview. But if you do end up in a role where you know it's not going to work for you at some point in your career, there may be a time when you say, I'm still going to have to stick it out for 2 years. Because as a hiring manager, I look at people's CVs. If they're too jumpy, it puts me off. It's a huge investment to onboard the right person. You don't want to be offboarding them 6 months later because either they were offered a couple of thousand more or because they're a jumper. So when you start a new role, you know, it's quite common to be told, don't expect to make a big impact in the first 3 months. You have your 100 days of listening. Presidents do their first 100 days when all they do is listen. So as an employee, also, you do your first few months. You can only really be impactful on non-task oriented stuff once you've really understood the culture of the organization and what it is that's being asked of you, and that doesn't happen overnight. So to leave after 6 months or a year, the organization has really lost out on you. So longevity of hires, it's like investments. Past performance may be an indicator of future performance. So if you've jumped around consecutively, that's a bit of a red flag. Having 1 or 2, no issue, but be careful about that. Sometimes I've had to just suck it up. Thank you, EY, for putting up with me. But yeah, it wasn't the right environment for me. I did make it to the 2-year mark, but it wasn't a joyful experience, I think, for either of us. So it's okay to get it wrong. It's not okay to keep getting it wrong when you know what does and doesn't work for you. So my interview skills, I actually feel bad for people who interview me because I have some really tough questions. You know, imagine that first date. Well, what would you like to call our second child? You know, those are the sorts of questions that if you know there's something that's a sticking point for you, you have to get it out there. You can't wait until after the contract's signed, everyone's really excited. It's a very small, round recruitment world out there, and word gets out soon about candidates. Yeah, so if you're going to sign up for a contract, you're going to have to actually commit to that contract and execute it well, because if not, someone will find out. And it could be the difference between you having the opportunity of a lifetime or not. So after EY, I went to EFG Private Bank, where I had a real baptism of fire in doing compliance monitoring. Why was it a baptism of fire? Because compliance monitoring wasn't really a thing at the point in time when I joined EFG. So although there were frameworks out there that the FCA had put out, there wasn't a lot of execution going on that was meaningful around compliance monitoring. And it had only just started to creep into regulation, and the supervision of it wasn't that tight. So it was like being given a blank piece of paper. And throughout the 4 years I was there, I was able to see the power of monitoring changing from it's a box to tick because the FCA have said so, to a really powerful way of reporting to the board on consensus-based findings and their consequent actions for approval, where previously that hadn't come under a single umbrella. You know, it had been sort of every tribe fighting for their own interests, and monitoring gave a helicopter view as a quasi-independent second line of defense, rather than as being fully within the second line of defense and then sort of being a compliance gone native sort of person. So that was really awesome. And I got to memorize and analyze the FCA handbook from cover to cover, and learning how to become not even a subject matter expert, but subject matter competent in knowing what questions to ask from each monitoring review to each monitoring review is a skill that I didn't even know was a skill until I had to apply it. And this is in the days before ChatGPT, because in about a year from now, none of us will be able to remember how we worked without ChatGPT. But this was in the days where you had to go and research from a number of sources and do your own meta-analysis and do your own interpretations, and you couldn't use big data to inform your decisions because that just wasn't in place. And being able to take on board a huge amount of information, being able to absorb new information as if you're hungry and that's a really good meal every day, that's what I believe has put me in a good position, because we're in such a dynamic environment. If your specialty is MiFID II, you've probably been out of work for a few years, because MiFID II has sort of been and gone in terms of all the sexy implementation. Now it's just run, now it's just reporting individuals. And compliance generalists have absorbed all that special knowledge the MiFID II specialists had. And we'll see the same thing now with the consumer duty. You'll have consumer duty specialists, because they've taken the time to really dig deep, to read, to understand, to contextualize what is quite a narrow piece of regulation. But 3-4 years from now, there won't be consumer duty specialists, there will be compliance generalists who really get the consumer duty. So I guess the messaging there is that specialization has for me, but only as part of a build-up as a portfolio of skills, so I can go forward to be a generalist who's ready to accept the next black swan. And what do I mean by black swan? We kind of know where regulation's going to come at us, but we don't know the form. And when it does arrive, it's after consultation, so get involved in those consultations, even as an observer, because it helps with the understanding of the specialist subject matter. Even as a volunteer, where you pop up your hand and say, I'd love to take minutes at that meeting because it's a subject I'm really interested in, but I'm just a really good minute taker, so I can do some heavy lifting for you and I get to benefit. Putting yourself out there, whether it's in industry groups, whether it's internally, whether it's on LinkedIn, you get great responses. And that kind of brings me up to where TradFi, and then I fell into crypto. And how did I fall into crypto? I was working for Pay.UK, which is the UK Payments Authority, as their head of compliance. And having lifted the hood on that and seeing what to me appeared to be an inefficient and inequitable access to payment rails by fintechs and startups, and it was very big bank dominated, I understood that I wanted to be in fintech, and crypto allowed payments without payment rails. And for the unbanked and the underbanked, that is such a huge thing, to liberate economies, not having thought of the compliance aspects at that point. And so I dived into crypto and landed my first role in crypto, which was very much a hybrid. All we've ever done is TradFi. We're going to do a little bit of crypto, UK DOM resident. It's going to be Bitcoin only. I thought, well, I can do that. And once you get your toe in the water with that very narrow slice of something you don't know, backed up by the broad background of everything you do, you're in a much better position. And actually, Michelle, you can comment on this probably to much higher impact than I can, is how many women do you come across who you've got a list of 10 things a prospective employer wants, and they tick 8 really well, but there's 2 they don't. You know, what do guys say and what do women say in that situation?
There's generally, there is a trend that we see whereby female talent maybe look at the elements that they can't do and make a decision not to apply for a role based on that, but it's maybe the 8 remaining points are overlooked that they can do very well. And I don't mean to generalize here, but 17 years in the industry, doing what I do, there has generally been that consensus of females maybe not putting themselves in the best place possible to get that job because they only look at the elements of an opportunity that they can't do, whereby some male talent may just have a little bit more of a let's go for it attitude. It's a really interesting concept actually, and there are some stats to back this up that I have looked into, but it's very much why, and I was going to come on to this question with you anyway later, but it's why we look at how can we influence more female talent coming through the ranks and looking at the gender balance, which is part of a lot of companies' D&I policy. And it's something that's very centric to us as well as a business, certainly within my team here, within risk regulation compliance specifically. It is a really interesting point, Shelley, that you mentioned. And we work with a lot of C-suite peers like yourself who are female talent, and some of them have gone on to host some events that I've hosted as well. So yeah, I mean, the shift is becoming more of a want from companies to look at a 50-50 D&I balance in leadership roles, and we're supporting them to do that. But yes, it's looking at the rising female talent as well to enable companies to put themselves in that position. So it's why we run these podcasts and series to, like you said, empower women and encourage women.
And what I have observed, and I take this away from the experience I had at EFG, again, tremendous leadership there, a great boss who was technically superb. So I always felt a little bit awed by him. And I just think, wow, this guy knows so much. How does he know so much? And this was at a stage in my career where I wasn't C-suite. And then I became C-suite and became privy to a view of organizations that I'd never had before. And that's how he was so smart. So you can't have people performing at C-suite level if they've never been in C-suite. So for me, the lesson I've taken away from that is no matter how confidential, no matter how sensitive, you can create C-suite meetings that 50% of the meeting can be clean enough to be mentoring people by having them observe those parts of the meeting so they get an understanding of the scope of information you're exposed to and the interests you're meant to balance in C-suite, which is very different to being a compliance person or an engineering person or a legal person, where your orientation is task orientation and your team orientation. From C-suite, you have strategic orientation, because achieving the objectives of the organization are real and tangible to you. They're not some sort of vision statement on the wall. They're not profit objectives that you're never going to benefit from. It's very real and tangible outcomes that you have the opportunity to influence. So I would like for everyone who is under that ExCo or C-suite level, be kind to yourself, be nice to yourself. It's not necessarily that people who are more senior to you and therefore have access to a more diversified information set are smarter than you. They're just better informed because of seniority in many instances. So don't think you're not capable of doing the job because you haven't been given access to the information. And you're right about this list of 10, and the women will focus on the 2 things they don't know how to do. A tiny bit of research into how complex those 2 things are can really support an application. And I love it when I hear someone say, I've never done this, but here's what I've done that feels just like that and gives me the transferable skills. I love that, because they're also showing an agility of saying, well, it's X plus Y, but I want to come out with Z instead of X plus Y. And so that analytical joining the dots together and saying, well, I know this is what you wanted, but do you really want that? You might want this, it could be better. And it would be a broader approach and you will get a sensible, So there are ways of turning lemons into lemonade, even in the context of job applications not being a perfect fit.
Yeah. What more do you think can be done to influence younger female talent generally within financial services, maybe payments and crypto more specifically, where you've specialised over the last few years?
So payments and crypto is less well paid, less stable, poorer benefits than banking, traditional banking and traditional asset management, finance, etc. So accordingly, very overpopulated with women, because you can pay them less and they'll be really happy. You can't pay them less, but firms have developed cultures where, for example, a payment institution will pay a different amount for a head of compliance than a TradFi bank.
Yes.
And I mean, that is just out there. The statistics hold it up. So a guy who is working in TradFi banking will not be interested in working for a payments institution, because they can get more money staying in TradFi and they look like everyone else in TradFi. Whereas you come into NewFi and you're really taking a flyer on a lot of things, because there isn't that stability, there isn't the pension provision, there isn't the private medical, and you're not going to have the resources at your disposal that you have in TradFi. So the downside to that is your day is really busy and it matters. If you don't turn up to work, everybody notices. In TradFi, you will have your allocated tasks and responsibilities, and you need something printing, you go to the print room. You need something to happen with PR, you go to the PR team. In NewFi, many organizations do not have that maturity. And so if you need something doing, it's up to you to do it. So if you work in compliance and you're joining a startup with 40 people, you may be asked to be head of legal, head of governance, head of HR, and head of compliance. if someone leaves the day you join, or if someone has not yet joined and those roles are empty, because everything needs allocating. So you get massive stretch. There are issues there with being hardcore, and you've got to think about work-life balance with that. But in terms of growth opportunities, the sky's the limit compared to TradFi. So what can women do to encourage other women? Mentor, 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 and mentor generously. And if you're 21 years old, then mentor a 20-year-old. If you're 30 years old, mentor a 28-year-old. If you're 28, you can mentor a 60-year-old, because we don't know how to switch our computers on. So there is like a really symbiotic relationship between generational mentoring and mid-career. It's just the right thing to do. That's how you build your network. It's how you pay back to society. It's how you change things, by embedding your good experiences, your good practices, giving someone that encouragement so they don't give up. So you end up with people who may have had a difficult ride or may have made mistakes, but if you've helped them get through that, they are much better people at the end of it than someone who's never faced hardship. They're going to be much more engaging as a person, much more mature as an employee, because they'll know how to deal when bad stuff happens. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And you've referred to just a moment ago TradFi and NewFi. Worth, if you don't mind, just exploring that a little bit more in terms of changes that you've seen, maybe what you've noticed in mentality, ability, and clearly the whole purpose of what we're doing today. And with the series is looking at female talent and maybe the uptick in that as well. So what are those changes, Shelley, that you've seen specifically?
So I can see that in TradFi, it is still very much plod, process. And for change to happen, because of the pace of governance, it can take easily 6 months for any change to be signed off and then to be executed. So what I see is that the pace in TradFi is the pace TradFi's always been. In NewFi, what I see is an agility which has been missing from TradFi forever, if I can say. The ability to pivot and still retain your core values and your core propositions. Instead, with TradFi, when stuff goes wrong, it's basically you shut down and you start again. Whereas in NewFi, you pivot, you keep what was good, you try and learn from what went wrong. So I think observationally, there is much more ability to build something, try it out. If it breaks, it's not the end of the world. It's now you know how not to build it. Let's go back and build again. I don't think you get that leniency of effort being invested to naught or to a lesson learned only. In TradFi, I think it's much easier to throw people under the bus, assign blame, exit people so that that sort of thing that didn't happen well stays segregated from the business. And NewFi, we're always looking at the best way to do things, and so you try three things simultaneously, and one of those is going to work better than the other two. It doesn't mean the other two weren't good ideas, even if in the end they were good ideas. So yeah, it's about saying the things you can't say in other circumstances, so a lot less formality. Being a solutionizer, everyone can see the problems. No one's interested in further articulating the problems. Our space is fraught with problems. And so it's the solution seeking that can take ideas from traditional finance, because that's what looks and feels familiar, not just to regulators, but also to investors and auditors. And you've got to pass muster with all of them. So conceptualizing TradFi into NewFi spaces is something that I'm seeing that is the hottest talent in NewFi. And it's not a common talent because it does take creativity and it takes a degree of risk-taking, calculated risk-taking. But to be able to be confident to say, well, if this is how products are manufactured under MiFID II to be compliant, then I'm willing to look at whether my crypto product manufacturing, if I follow the same process, I'm going to assess the same sort of risk considerations, customer outcome considerations. To me, that feels like, even if it's not regulated yet, when it is, I'm not going to have much backhauling to do. And it's those sorts of approaches that looking for the future and being proactive rather than reacting to what you're told to do is the biggest difference in the space. And I believe that it's not even just a female trait, it's just a prepper trait, is that you'll build something that's compliant by design rather than going for minimum viable compliance in an overlay. You'll build something more sustainable. Because in a startup, you've got to go back and fix it if you got it wrong. So you might as well get it as right as you possibly can, because there isn't a team of thousands around you to do the heavy lifting. You are doing the heavy lifting. And that's awesome and scary at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point. And I mean, every business has a challenge, right? That's why they need a CCO, Chief Compliance Officer, like yourself to join. So no business should then face hiring challenges or D&I challenges, but inevitably they do. So yeah. What have you found to be the biggest challenge, if any, or how diverse have you found hiring as well throughout the companies you've worked for? It'd be really interesting to get to know from your own personal experience.
So I see that one of the challenges in the marketplace is that compliance people are really underpaid compared to other parts of financial services until you reach the very top. And that means that as a discipline, compliance loses talent that it shouldn't be losing. Because then what is it? Success of the most mediocre? It doesn't feel right that it doesn't get the same sort of investment as other analytical roles in finance. So you do end up with talent drains and people just saying, a bit like nursing, once it's not your calling, why would anyone do that? And so keeping it as a calling, showing that compliance is effective as a tool for good is one thing that I'm always thrilled to do, because I do believe compliance works. It might only work 1% of the time, but that's an awful lot better than none of the time. Yeah. And that 1%, that's a real number for anti-money laundering. But I have to say that, that 1% is worth it to me because it's 1% of a very, very big number. My wish for every compliance hiring manager is that they had much bigger budgets, because then you'd be able to tempt people from associated disciplines like audit, like law, like governance. And that way you'd end up with more rounded compliance individuals rather than, I can't think of anything sadder than someone who all they've done is AML their whole lives. It's a pretty narrow field. So unless you're an MLRO with huge responsibilities and all you're being is an analyst your whole life, there is so much more you'd be talented at doing, but you'll never get the opportunity because it's a narrow discipline. And I would love to see that changed. I think that AML analysts, after 3 years, they're ready to now decide what they want to do when they grow up. And it shouldn't be that most of them want to be MLROs. It should be now they have a grounding in this, they can go and do anything, because it's common sense, it's analytical thinking, it's research methodologies, it's building processes that actually work at finding needles in a haystack. So it's amazing skills until you've done it for too long and then you're just ticking boxes.
Yeah. What advice would you give to the younger females in the industry, Shelley?
Well, my advice would be is, first of all, remember no one ever died of a compliance emergency. So be kind to yourself. Judge what the culture is around you, and don't be the person who's in first and staying till latest. That is not what wins you the promotion. What wins you the promotion is being useful and valuable, and you get to be useful and valuable. I believe that delivering value that is contingent upon you being really good at what you do, but then demonstrating your value is because you do more than what you just do, or you have a knowledge suite that is beyond what is expected of you in a narrow role, and your willingness and your ability to join up the dots between something you should know and something that you know by chance. That's where you demonstrate value, and that's where you stand out as not just a candidate, but an employee who is going to move forwards. Because if all you're doing is the job you're employed to do really well, that's not signaling to me that you're ready for the next step up. It's by doing that, it's just like, you're done with that. As soon as it's like 2 o'clock, you're all done with that. And the next 3 hours are spent on really adding value and plugging gaps where they're needed, and keeping a full record of those, so that when it comes to appraisal time and you say, I think I'm a 5 out of 5, you've got an evidence basis for saying that. And being commercial, I think. The minute you can be commercial and say, my project saved us this amount of money, or we have created an efficiency that generates a reallocation of budget of this amount, you have to know how to do the numbers. Because if you can't back up a business proposal with the numbers, no one's going to listen anyway. And it matters. You know, there will be people in every organization who are just like, fine, show me the numbers. And they're generally the ones who hold the checkbook. And so if you're not persuading them, nothing you want to do that needs resource gets to be done. And they need to be your best friend. Like, if compliance is not besties with finance, then there's something gone wrong on compliance's side, because it should be a symbiotic relationship. They should see the benefits, and you should let them know that those benefits will be continually reviewed, because without being commercial, none of us have a job.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. So, really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your story and your insights. Very much appreciated. There's quite a lot of similarity, I think, as well, between certainly compliance being the backbone of a lot of institutions, but certainly some of the difficulties faced and the challenges, and it's how we encourage women to take that forward-looking approach, and what's next, and where can I add that value. So yeah, thank you, Shelley.
That's okay. I mean, if I can summarize the advice to women, is one, be really kind to yourself. Not everyone can do this, right? So if you can do compliance and you're interested in compliance, treat that as the gift it is, because it is a gift to do compliance. It's enormously creative. It's history, politics, and lots of other lovely stuff, all wrapped into one, and you get to operationalize it. So it's a gift. If this is your space and you're comfortable in it, be nice to yourself. Be ambitious. Have a plan, and don't keep that plan to yourself. Share that plan with your line manager, with your mentor, because of course you will have a mentor, potentially in a different firm, most usefully probably in a different firm. You know, where's your next job offer going to come from? And leverage your mentor. The third thing is give back. So if you've learned something that was useful for you, make sure you share that with other people. Have a modest LinkedIn profile. It's not about being out and loud and proud. It's about having something meaningful to say, and building your network through offering support and being able to receive support. Fourth thing is always be nice to salespeople. You'd be surprised the number of vendors that I deal with on a daily basis, and I see this happen all the time, that compliance people go, someone else with an AML solution. They have a really tough job. It's not easy doing what they do, and they have a network of contacts that if you're nice to them and if you're kind to them, and you can have a meaningful conversation, even if it doesn't result in a sale for them, they will remember you. Bring them into your network and just be nice. It doesn't cost anything. You can be nice in the same time it takes you to be nasty when you're approached on LinkedIn with, oh, have you got time for a coffee? You know, go back and say, I don't have time for a coffee because I'm really busy, but I love what you do. You've got a tough job on your shoulders. Carry on. I'll follow your content. Cheers. Bye. When my roadmap's got this on it, I'll reach out to you. You don't have to be, go away, horrible little man. And the last thing is have your enough number. So don't look at being paid the most you can be paid. Look to be paid equally with other people in an organization. And don't look to move jobs from a good job if the job you're in, you're getting paid enough. And you'll never know what enough feels like until you decide what your enough number is. And it's like retirement planning. You know, how are you going to just get to 65 and not have sorted out what your budget could look like? And it's the same with working. How do you know a 150K job is going to make you so much happier than a 100K job if you don't know what you're going to do with the additional money? So the money is recognition and reward, and that truly matters. But beyond a certain point, decide where your values are, what matters to you, and stick to that inside and outside the workplace. Just be your full authentic self, because it's really a gift to be able to do that too. And yeah, look me up on LinkedIn. If you want a mentor, here I am. I'm a little bit time poor, but I really, you know, you've got a good question, never be shy to ask, and you will have my attention. I guarantee that.
Thank you, Shelley.
Wow.
Some great advice there. Shelley, thanks for joining us today. Much appreciated. And listeners, please stay tuned for our next edition, which will be coming very soon. Check us out on our LinkedIn page and social media channels, and the next one will be coming very soon.